They say wisdom comes with age, but apparently not according to my daughter-in-law, Jessica. For 3 years, she'd been treating me like I was one step away from a nursing home, rolling her eyes whenever I tried to contribute to conversations about technology, finance, or basically anything that happened after 1995. Little did she know that while she was busy explaining how smartphones work to someone who'd been trading cryptocurrency since 2015, I was quietly building an empire that would make her monthly shopping budget look like pocket change. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Linda Chen, and at 62, I've learned that sometimes the biggest mistake people make is assuming they know everything about you based on the number of candles on your birthday cake. This story begins on a Tuesday morning in September, when I was standing in my son Michael's kitchen, trying to help prepare for what was supposed to be a family celebration. Jessica had just gotten a promotion at her marketing firm, and we were throwing a small dinner party to celebrate. I was excited to be included, thrilled that maybe finally my relationship with my daughter-in-law was warming up after years of polite but distant interactions. I had offered to bring my famous rosemary focaccia bread, the same recipe that had won 3 blue ribbons at the county fair back when Michael was in high school. But when I suggested we could order some nice wine to go with dinner, Jessica's response cut through me like a knife through butter. She turned to Michael with that exasperated expression I'd grown to recognize, the one that usually preceded her treating me like a confused elderly relative who'd wandered into the wrong conversation. "Your mom doesn't understand how expensive good wine is these days," she said, not even bothering to look at me directly. "Everything's different now. The market has completely changed. It's not like when she was our age." Then she turned to me with that condescending smile that made my blood pressure spike. "Linda, you're just too old to understand how money works in today's economy. Why don't you just focus on your bread recipe and leave the adult decisions to us?" The words hung in the air like smoke from a grease fire. Michael, bless his heart, looked uncomfortable but didn't say anything. He never did when Jessica made these little digs. I suppose after 5 years of marriage, he'd learned to pick his battles, and defending his mother apparently wasn't one worth fighting. I stood there, wooden spoon in hand, feeling that familiar mixture of hurt and frustration that had become the soundtrack to our family gatherings. What Jessica didn't know was that I understood money better than she ever would. While she was stressing about making the minimum payment on her credit cards and trying to figure out how to afford their mortgage on a 2-bedroom condo in the suburbs, I was managing a portfolio that would have made her quarterly bonus look like lunch money. But I'd never said anything about my financial situation to anyone in the family, because I'd learned early in life that money changes everything, and I wanted to know who my son really was and who he'd chosen to marry before wealth entered the equation. The irony wasn't lost on me that Jessica worked in marketing, supposedly understanding consumer behavior and market trends, yet she couldn't see past the surface of a 62-year-old woman who dressed modestly and drove a 5-year-old Honda Civic. She saw what she expected to see, someone from a different generation who probably still balanced her checkbook by hand and thought the internet was some kind of passing fad. If only she knew that I'd been day trading since before she graduated college, or that my hobby of restoring vintage furniture had turned into a 7-figure business with clients across 3 states. I had started small, buying broken pieces, from estate sales and garage sales, fixing them up in my garage and selling them online. What began as a way to keep busy after my divorce from Michael's father had evolved into something much larger. I had a keen eye for valuable pieces that others overlooked, and more importantly, I understood the digital marketplace in ways that surprised even me. Social media wasn't just for sharing family photos in my world. It was a powerful business tool that had connected me with interior designers, antique collectors, and wealthy clients who appreciated both craftsmanship and authenticity. My business, Heritage Restorations, had grown organically through word of mouth and strategic online presence, I'd restored pieces for celebrities, politicians, and business leaders who valued discretion as much as quality work. My client list. Read like a who's who of influential people. But I kept that information locked away tighter than Fort Knox. Privacy was paramount in my business, and reputation was everything. One careless word about a client's personal taste or financial situation could destroy years of careful relationship building. But Jessica didn't see any of that when she looked at me. She saw someone who needed technology explained to her, someone who probably still used coupons and shopped at discount stores. She wasn't entirely wrong about the coupons and discount stores, actually, but her reasoning was completely off base. I'd learned that wealth was best preserved by smart spending habits, not flashy displays of financial power. The truly wealthy people I worked with understood this principle. They bought quality pieces that held their value rather than trendy, items that would be worthless in a few years. Standing in that kitchen, listening to Jessica explain why I couldn't possibly understand modern economics, I made a decision that would change everything. I was tired of being treated like a relic from a bygone era. I was tired of watching my son allow his wife to dismiss and disrespect the woman who had raised him as a single mother, working 2 jobs to put him through college debt-free. Most of all, I was tired of pretending that her condescension didn't hurt. The dinner party proceeded as planned, with Jessica holding court about her promotion and her plans for their future. She talked about wanting to buy a bigger house, about how they deserved better than their current neighborhood, about how Michael needed to be more ambitious if they were going to achieve the lifestyle she wanted. I listened to her paint a picture of financial struggle and social climbing that would have been amusing if it weren't so painful to watch my son agree with every word. Michael had always been a gentle soul, more interested in his job as a high school history teacher than in accumulating wealth or status symbols. I'd raised him to value integrity and kindness over material possessions, and for the most part, he'd embraced those values. But Jessica had slowly been reshaping his priorities, convincing him that his modest salary was something to be ashamed of, that his contentment with their current life was actually a lack of ambition. Watching this transformation had been heartbreaking, but I'd told myself that marriage was about compromise, and maybe she would help him reach potentials I couldn't see. That night, as I drove home to my modest 2-bedroom house in the older part of town, I reflected on the path that had brought me to this moment. After my divorce 15 years ago, I could have easily fallen into bitterness or self-pity. Instead, I'd thrown myself into rebuilding not just furniture, but my entire life. Every piece I restored had taught me something new about patience, about seeing potential where others saw only damage, about the satisfaction that comes from creating something beautiful with your own hands. My house might not have looked like much from the outside, but inside it was a showcase of my work. Every piece of furniture had a story, had been carefully chosen and restored to its full glory. My living room featured a 1920s mahogany dining set that I'd rescued from a demolition site and spent 6 months bringing back to life. The bedroom held a Victorian vanity that had been painted over so many times, it looked like a garage sale reject when I found it. But underneath all those layers was stunning carved walnut that now gleamed like honey in the afternoon sunlight. More importantly, my basement held my real workshop, equipped with professional-grade tools and restoration supplies that represented years of reinvestment in my craft. This wasn't a hobby setup. This was a serious business operation that generated serious revenue. I had waiting lists of clients, standing orders from high-end dealers, and a reputation for quality that commanded premium prices. My profit margins were healthy because I understood both the artistic and business sides of restoration work. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The financial success had been almost accidental at first. I'd started selling pieces simply to make room for new projects, but quickly realized that my eye for undervalued antiques and my skill in restoration created a powerful combination. A piece I might buy for $50 at an estate sale could sell for $5,000 after I'd worked my magic on it. As my reputation grew, so did the caliber of my clientele and the prices they were willing to pay for my work. But success had brought its own challenges. The more money I made, the more careful I became about keeping that information private. I'd seen too many families torn apart by money, too many relationships poisoned by greed and resentment. When Michael was growing up, I'd been careful to provide for him without making him feel entitled to wealth he hadn't earned. I taught him the value of hard work and self-reliance, perhaps too well, because he seemed genuinely unaware that his mother had become quite successful in her own right. The morning after the dinner party, I sat in my workshop polishing a 1930s Art Deco cabinet that would soon grace the home of a technology executive in California. As I worked, I thought about Jessica's words and the pattern of disrespect that had been building over the years. It wasn't just about money or age. It was about basic human dignity. She treated me like my opinions didn't matter, like my experiences had no value, like my presence in their lives was more of an obligation than a blessing. I thought about all the times I'd bitten my tongue when she made snide comments about my clothes, my car, my house, my supposed lack of understanding about the modern world. I remembered the birthday dinner where she'd loudly explained to everyone at the table how difficult it was for older people to adapt to new technology, while I sat there having just completed a complex online negotiation for a piece being shipped from an auction house in France. I recalled the afternoon she'd lectured me about the importance of having a retirement plan, completely unaware that my investment portfolio was larger than most people's retirement funds. The breaking point wasn't just about one comment or one moment of disrespect. It was about the accumulation of small cruelties, the death by 1,000 cuts that had slowly eroded my relationship with my son and made family gatherings feel more like endurance tests than celebrations. But more than that, it was about what I saw happening to Michael. He was changing, becoming someone I didn't recognize, someone who could sit silently while his wife belittled his mother. That afternoon, I made a phone call that would set everything in motion. My financial advisor, Patricia Morrison, had been managing my investments for 8 years and had become more friend than professional contact. She'd watched my business grow from a small side operation to a substantial enterprise, and she understood both my desire for privacy and my commitment to financial responsibility. "Patricia," I said when she answered, "I think it's time to make some changes to how I handle my financial situation. I need to have a serious conversation with my family, and I want to make sure I'm approaching this correctly." Patricia had been expecting this call for years. She'd often wondered how I managed to keep my success so completely separate from my family relationships, and she'd occasionally suggested that a little transparency might solve some of the interpersonal problems I'd mentioned during our meetings. But she'd also respected my desire to maintain privacy and had helped me structure my finances in ways that allowed maximum discretion. "What kind of changes are you thinking about?" she asked, though I suspected she already knew where this conversation was heading. "I want to start being more open about my financial situation," I explained. "Not because I want to show off or prove anything, but because I'm tired of being treated like I don't understand basic economics by people who struggle to balance their own checkbooks." We spent an hour discussing strategies and potential consequences. Patricia helped me understand the tax implications of various approaches and suggested ways to protect my assets while still making my point. By the end of our conversation, I had a clear plan for how to handle the situation, and more importantly, I had the confidence that comes from knowing you're making decisions based on sound financial principles rather than emotional reactions. The opportunity to put my plan into action came sooner than expected. 3 days later, Michael called to invite me to Sunday brunch at their favorite restaurant, an upscale place in the city that they visited for special occasions. He sounded excited about something, and when I asked what the occasion was, he mentioned that Jessica had some news to share with the family. I agreed to meet them, already suspecting what the news might be. Jessica had been dropping hints about wanting to start a family, and given the timing of her promotion and their recent focus on needing a bigger house, I guessed they were probably planning to announce a pregnancy. Part of me was excited about the possibility of becoming a grandmother, but another part worried about how this news might complicate an already strained relationship. The restaurant was exactly the kind of place that Jessica loved: trendy, expensive, and full of the kind of people she considered important. We were seated at a prime table near the window, and I could see her scanning the room to see if she recognized anyone who might be impressed by her choice of venue. This was vintage Jessica, always aware of appearances and social positioning. After we'd ordered, Jessica launched into her announcement with the kind of dramatic flair she brought to most situations. She was indeed pregnant, about 8 weeks along, and they were thrilled about starting their family. Michael beamed with pride as she described their plans for converting their spare room into a nursery and their hopes for providing their child with every possible advantage in life. I was genuinely happy for them, despite my complicated feelings about Jessica. The prospect of a grandchild filled me with joy, and I could see how excited Michael was about becoming a father. But as Jessica continued talking about their plans, the conversation inevitably turned to money and the financial pressures of raising a child. "We're going to need to make some serious changes to our budget," Jessica explained, her tone taking on that familiar edge of financial stress. "Childcare alone is going to cost us more than our mortgage payment, and don't even get me started on the cost of everything from cribs to college funds." Michael nodded along, looking slightly overwhelmed by the financial reality of parenthood. "We've been looking at bigger places," he added, "but everything in our price range is either too far from work or needs major renovations. It's frustrating because we know what we want, but we just can't afford it right now." This was where Jessica's true colors always showed most clearly. She turned to me with that expectant look I'd learned to dread, the one that meant she was about to ask for something while simultaneously making it clear that she didn't think I'd be able to help. "Linda," she said, using the tone she might use with a child who was slow to understand something obvious, "we were hoping you might be able to help us out a little bit. Nothing major, obviously, because we know you're on a fixed income and probably struggling yourself, but maybe you could contribute something small toward the baby's expenses or help with the nursery furniture." The request itself wasn't unreasonable. Grandparents often help with expenses related to grandchildren, and I would have been happy to contribute under different circumstances. But it was the way she asked, the assumption that any help I could provide would necessarily be modest, the implication that I should be grateful to be included in their financial planning at all. "I mean," she continued, apparently not reading the expression on my face correctly, "we don't expect much. We know that people your age usually don't have a lot of extra money lying around. Social Security doesn't go very far these days, and I'm sure your little furniture hobby doesn't bring in much income." There it was again. The dismissal of my work as a little hobby, the assumption that I was living on Social Security, the condescending tone that made every word feel like a small slap. But this time, something was different. This time, I didn't bite my tongue or force a smile or change the subject to avoid confrontation. "Actually, Jessica," I said, my voice calm but carrying an edge that made both her and Michael look at me more carefully, "I think there might be some misunderstandings about my financial situation that we should probably clear up." I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, opening the mobile banking app that Jessica had probably assumed I was too old to understand. With the screen facing her, I showed her my primary checking account balance. The number was substantial enough to cover several years of their current mortgage payments, but it was just the tip of the iceberg. Jessica's eyes widened as she processed what she was seeing. That's your checking account?" she stammered, clearly trying to make sense of how someone she'd categorized as financially limited could have that much money in what was essentially pocket change. "That's just my everyday spending account," I explained, enjoying the look of confusion spreading across her face. "Would you like to see my business accounts, or my investment portfolio, or maybe the real estate holdings?" Michael was staring at me like I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. "Mom, what business accounts? What real estate holdings? What are you talking about? This was the moment I'd been both dreading and anticipating for years. The moment when I would have to explain to my son that his mother, the woman he thought he knew so well, had been living a completely different life than he'd imagined. The moment when Jessica would have to confront the reality that she'd been condescending to someone who could probably buy and sell her several times over. I took a deep breath and began to tell them about heritage restorations, about the clients and the profits and the investments that had grown over 15 years of careful business building. I explained about the property I owned in 3 different states, about the art collection that served as both personal enjoyment and financial investment, about the diversified portfolio that generated more passive income in a month than Jessica made in salary. As I talked, I watched their faces change from confusion to shock, to something that looked almost like fear. This wasn't the story they'd expected to hear. This wasn't the limited, financially dependent mother and mother-in-law they thought they knew. This was someone who had been quietly building wealth while they worried about mortgage payments and credit card balances. "Why didn't you ever tell us any of this?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself for years. "Because I wanted to know who you really were," I answered honestly. "I wanted to know what kind of man you'd become, what kind of woman you'd choose to marry, what your values really were when money wasn't part of the equation." The silence that followed was deafening. Jessica sat frozen, her mouth slightly open, apparently struggling to reconcile this new information with everything she thought she knew about me. Michael looked hurt and confused, as if he was questioning everything he'd believed about our relationship. Finally, Jessica found her voice. "So you've been lying to us this whole time? Pretending to be poor while we worried about money and struggled with our bills?" "I never lied about anything," I replied calmly. "I never claimed to be poor, and I never asked you to worry about my financial situation. You made assumptions based on how I chose to live, and I let you make those assumptions because they revealed important truths about your character." The accusation in her voice was unmistakable now. "You let us think you needed help, that you were just getting by on Social Security and whatever little bit you made from your hobby. That's deceptive, Linda. That's manipulative." I could feel my temper rising, but I kept my voice steady. "What's manipulative, Jessica, is treating someone with disrespect because you think they can't afford to fight back. What's deceptive is measuring someone's worth based on what you think their bank account looks like." Michael was still processing, trying to understand the implications of what he'd learned. "Mom, if you have all this money, why do you live in that little house? Why do you drive that old car? Why do you dress like— why don't you live like you're wealthy?" It was a reasonable question from someone who'd grown up around people like Jessica, people who believed that wealth should be displayed as openly and obviously as possible. "Because real wealth isn't about showing off," I explained. "It's about security and freedom and the ability to make choices based on what you want, rather than what you can afford." I could see that this concept was foreign to Jessica, who had always equated success with visible symbols of prosperity. Her idea of wealth was designer handbags and luxury cars and houses in the right neighborhoods. She couldn't understand. Someone who had the money for all those things, but chose to live modestly and invest wisely instead. "Besides," I continued, looking directly at Jessica, "I've learned that when people know you have money, it changes how they treat you. Sometimes for the better, but often for the worse. I preferred knowing that people liked me for who I was, not for what I could do for them financially." The implications of this statement hung heavy in the air. Jessica was clearly realizing that every condescending comment she'd made, every assumption about my limitations, every dismissive attitude she'd displayed was now being viewed through a completely different lens. She wasn't dealing with a financially dependent older woman who had to accept whatever treatment she received. She was dealing with someone who had choices and the power that comes with financial independence. "So, what happens now?" Michael asked, his voice small and uncertain. It was the question I'd been dreading, because I didn't have a simple answer. The damage to our relationship wasn't something that could be fixed with money or explanations. Trust, once broken, is difficult to rebuild, and respect, once lost, is even harder to regain. Now, I said carefully, we figure out how to move forward with honesty instead of assumptions. But even as I said the words, I could see in Jessica's eyes that she was already calculating what this new information might mean for her. The woman who had been lecturing me about understanding modern economics was now looking at me like I was a lottery ticket she'd just discovered in an old purse. The shift from condescension to avarice was so swift it was almost comical. "Well," she said, forcing a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes, "this changes everything, doesn't it? I mean, now that we know about your situation, we can make much better plans for the baby. You could help us get that bigger house we've been looking at, maybe set up a college fund, ensure your grandchild has every advantage." And there it was. The moment when Jessica revealed that her apology for past behavior would be measured entirely in terms of future financial benefit. Not remorse for the disrespect she'd shown, not acknowledgement of the hurt she'd caused, but immediate calculation of how much this new information might be worth to her. Michael, to his credit, looked uncomfortable with his wife's rapid transition from shock to opportunism. "Jessica, maybe we should slow down and think about this." But Jessica was already in full planning mode, her marketing background kicking in as she tried to reframe the entire situation to her advantage. "Think about what, Michael? Your mother has been hiding a fortune from us while we struggled to make ends meet. The least she can do is help us now that everything's out in the open." I sat there listening to her talk about my money as if it were already hers, watching her mental spreadsheet calculate exactly how much my revelation might be worth in terms of house payments and luxury expenses. This was exactly why I had kept my financial situation private for so long. This was the moment when Jessica showed me who she really was when money entered the picture. "Actually," I said, interrupting her planning session, "I think there are some things we need to discuss before we start making any assumptions about how my financial situation affects your plans." The tone of my voice must have conveyed something that made both of them pause and look at me more carefully. This wasn't the submissive, easily dismissed woman they thought they knew. This was someone who had built a successful business, managed significant wealth, and made important financial decisions for years without their input or approval. "What kind of things?" Jessica asked, though I could see the wariness creeping back into her expression. "Things like respect," I said simply. "Things like how we treat each other going forward. Things like whether the relationship we've had up to this point is the kind of relationship I want to continue having." The restaurant suddenly felt very quiet, as if the universe was holding its breath waiting to see what would happen next. This was the moment when everything would change, when the power dynamic that had defined our relationship for years would shift irreversibly. Jessica's face was cycling through emotions so quickly it was like watching a time-lapse video of weather. Patterns. Shock, calculation, anger, fear, and something that might have been the beginning of genuine recognition that she had seriously misjudged the situation. Michael was looking back and forth between his mother and his wife, like he was watching a tennis match, clearly overwhelmed by the rapid transformation of what should have been a simple pregnancy announcement into something much more complicated and potentially explosive. "Mom," he said finally, "what exactly are you saying?" It was a fair question, and one that deserved a clear answer. I had spent years accepting disrespect and condescension because I loved my son and wanted to maintain our relationship. But I had also reached a point where I realized that accepting bad treatment wasn't actually helping anyone, least of all Michael, who needed to understand that actions have consequences. "I'm saying that respect isn't something you get to turn on and off based on someone's bank balance," I replied. "I'm saying that if the only reason you want a relationship with me now is because you've learned I have money, then we don't really have a relationship worth preserving." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and I could see both of them struggling to figure out how to respond. This wasn't the conversation they'd expected to have when they invited me to brunch. This wasn't the outcome Jessica had anticipated when she made her casual request for financial help. But it was the conversation we needed to have. The one we should have had years ago when the pattern of disrespect first started. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to stop enabling their worst behavior, even when that someone is your own child. The next few days passed in an uncomfortable silence that felt heavier than any argument we might have had. Michael called twice, leaving voicemails that I didn't return immediately. Jessica sent a text message that was clearly crafted to sound apologetic while still managing to remind me about their financial needs and the upcoming baby. I ignored that too, needing time to process everything that had happened and decide how I wanted to move forward. My workshop became my sanctuary during this period. I threw myself into completing the Art Deco cabinet for my California client, finding peace in the familiar rhythm of sanding, staining, and polishing. There's something therapeutic about restoration work that goes beyond the physical process. Each piece tells a story of neglect and recovery, of seeing potential where others see only damage. In many ways, I was hoping the same could be true for my relationship with my family. The cabinet was nearly finished when Patricia called with an interesting proposition. One of her other clients, a tech entrepreneur named David Hartwell, was looking for someone to furnish his new estate with authentic vintage pieces. The project was substantial enough to keep me busy for months and potentially lucrative enough to represent a significant expansion of my business. He's specifically interested in working with artisans who understand both the historical significance and the investment value of quality pieces, Patricia explained. I immediately thought of you, but there's one complication. He wants to meet in person before making any commitments, and he's hosting a charity gala next weekend where he plans to interview potential contractors. The charity gala was being held at the Grand Metropolitan Hotel, one of the most exclusive venues in the city. It was exactly the kind of event that Jessica would have killed to attend, full of wealthy professionals and social influencers who represented everything she aspired to become. The irony wasn't lost on me that while she was lecturing me about not understanding modern economics, I was being invited to network with some of the most successful people in the region. I accepted Patricia's invitation and spent the rest of the week preparing for the event. This meant shopping for appropriate attire, something I rarely did since my usual wardrobe consisted of practical clothes suitable for workshop environments. The process of selecting an evening gown felt strange after years of deliberately downplaying my appearance, but I found myself enjoying the transformation. The dress I eventually chose was elegant but understated, a deep navy blue that complemented my silver hair and suggested confidence without ostentation. The shoes were more expensive than anything I'd worn in years, but they were an investment in presenting myself as someone serious about business relationships. Looking at myself in the mirror the night before the gala, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. The Grand Metropolitan Hotel was even more impressive than I'd expected. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over marble floors, and the guest list read like a directory of the city's most influential residents. I felt a flutter of nervousness as I approached the registration table, but it quickly dissipated when I reminded myself that I belonged here as much as anyone else. David Hartwell turned out to be younger than I'd expected, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of casual confidence that comes from achieving success before most people figure out what they want to do with their lives. He'd made his fortune developing apps that simplified complex financial processes, which explained his appreciation for both innovation and traditional craftsmanship. Our conversation flowed naturally from the beginning. He was genuinely interested in my restoration process and impressed by the portfolio I'd brought to show him. More importantly, he understood the business side of what I did and asked intelligent questions about sourcing, timeline management, and quality control. It was refreshing to discuss my work with someone who saw it as a serious profession rather than a quaint hobby. I've been looking for someone who can help me furnish my new place with pieces that have both character and investment potential," he explained as we moved through the hotel's art gallery, where several of his technology patents were being displayed alongside antique pieces from local collectors. "I want my home to tell a story, but I also want to make sure every dollar I spend is working for me financially." This was exactly the kind of client relationship I'd been hoping to develop. Someone who valued both artistry and business acumen, who understood that the best investments often come from patience and expertise rather than flashy speculation. We spent nearly an hour discussing his vision for the estate and my ideas for sourcing appropriate pieces. As the evening progressed, I found myself genuinely enjoying the social aspects of the event. The conversations were stimulating, the wine was excellent, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was among people who valued the same combination of creativity and business sense that had driven my own success. I was discussing market trends with a gallery owner when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Linda! Oh my God, Linda, is that really you?" I turned to find Jessica standing there in a black cocktail dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her expression caught between shock and something that looked suspiciously like panic. She was accompanied by a woman I didn't recognize, someone who radiated the kind of social ambition that Jessica herself aspired to project. "Hello, Jessica," I said calmly, noting how her eyes immediately began scanning my outfit, trying to calculate how much I'd spent and where I'd gotten the money to afford clothes that clearly hadn't come from a discount retailer. "I didn't expect to see you here," she stammered, obviously struggling to reconcile my presence at this exclusive event with her assumptions about my social and economic status. What brings you to something like this?" Before I could answer, David appeared at my side with 2 glasses of champagne, clearly assuming I was engaged in a pleasant social conversation rather than navigating a potential minefield. "Linda, I was hoping to introduce you to some of the other business owners here," he said, then noticed Jessica and extended his hand politely. "I'm David Hartwell. Any friend of Linda's is welcome to join our conversation." I watched Jessica's face cycle through several emotions as she processed this interaction. Here was one of the evening's most prominent guests, treating me like an equal, clearly comfortable with my presence in this exclusive environment. The woman who had spent years explaining to me why I couldn't understand modern business was witnessing me having casual conversations with exactly the kind of successful entrepreneur she'd always claimed was beyond my comprehension. "Jessica is my daughter-in-law," I explained to David, then turned back to her. "David is a potential client. We've been discussing a significant restoration project for his new estate." The word client hit Jessica like a physical blow. In her world, clients were what important people had, not what people like me were supposed to have. Clients implied business relationships with wealthy individuals, the kind of connections she'd been desperately trying to cultivate through her job in marketing. "A restoration project?" Jessica's companion asked, clearly interested in any conversation that might lead to networking opportunities. "What kind of restoration work do you do?" This was the moment when I could have downplayed my business, minimized my success, and allowed Jessica to maintain her illusions about my place in the economic hierarchy. Instead, I found myself describing heritage restorations with the kind of confidence and detail that the work deserved. I explained about the client base I'd developed, the investment value of properly restored antiques, and the growing market for authentic vintage pieces among collectors and interior designers. David added his own perspective about the business potential he saw in my work, mentioning the scope of the project we'd been discussing and his plans to recommend my services to other investors in his network. As I talked, I could see Jessica's worldview cracking like old paint. Everything she thought she knew about me, about my capabilities, about my place in the world, was being systematically dismantled by the evidence in front of her. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about competence, connections, and credibility in exactly the kind of professional environment she'd always assumed I couldn't navigate. "Your mother-in-law is quite impressive," Jessica's companion said to her with obvious admiration. I had no idea there was such potential in the restoration business. It sounds like she's built something really substantial. Jessica nodded, weakly, clearly struggling to maintain her composure while everything she'd believed about our relative positions in life shifted beneath her feet. Yes, she's always been very creative. The word creative hung in the air like a life preserver she was desperately clinging to, a way to acknowledge my work without admitting that it represented the kind of business success she'd always claimed I couldn't achieve. But even that small concession felt hollow in the face of the evidence surrounding us. David excused himself to speak with other guests, but not before confirming our meeting for the following week to finalize details of his project. As he walked away, Jessica's companion immediately began asking me questions about my business, clearly seeing potential networking opportunities that Jessica had completely missed. Do you ever work with interior designers? She asked. Because I know several who are always looking for reliable sources for quality vintage pieces. The market for authentic restoration work is incredibly strong right now. I found myself exchanging business cards and contact information with several people who approached our conversation, drawn by the mention of investment-quality antiques and authentic restoration services. Within 30 minutes, I had generated more potential business leads than Jessica had probably developed in months of networking through her marketing job. The contrast wasn't lost on Jessica, who stood beside me watching other people treat me with the kind of professional respect she'd never shown. These were successful business owners and social influencers, exactly the kind of people she'd always wanted to impress, and they were impressed by me. When we finally had a moment alone, Jessica's carefully maintained composure began to crack. Linda, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. I waited, curious to see what question had been burning in her mind throughout this entire encounter. How long have you been coming to events like this? How long have you been moving in these circles without telling us? It was a fair question, though not necessarily the one I'd expected. This is actually my first time at something quite this formal, I admitted. But I've been doing business with people like this for years. You don't build a client base like mine without developing relationships with people who can afford quality work. The admission seemed to hit her even harder than if I'd claimed to be a regular at such events. The idea that I'd been quietly building these kinds of professional relationships while she struggled to establish herself in much smaller social circles was clearly devastating to her sense of how the world was supposed to work. Why didn't you ever mention any of this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why did you let us think you were just someone who fixed furniture as a hobby? It was the same question Michael had asked at the restaurant, but coming from Jessica, it carried different implications. She wasn't hurt by my secrecy. She was angry about missed opportunities. She was calculating how many networking events she could have attended as my guest, how many business connections she could have leveraged, how much social capital she could have gained by association. Because I wanted our relationship to be based on who we were as people, not on what I could do for you professionally, I answered honestly. I wanted to know if you could respect me without knowing about my business success. The silence that followed was telling. Jessica was realizing that she had failed a test she didn't even know she was taking, and now she was faced with the consequences of years of condescension and disrespect towards someone who had actually achieved more professional success than she had. I think I made some mistakes, she said finally, though her tone suggested she was more concerned about future opportunities than past behavior. Maybe we could start over, now that everything's out in the open. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a text message from Michael. He was asking if we could meet for coffee the next day to talk about everything that had happened. The timing felt significant. He was reaching out just as Jessica was discovering the full extent of how much she'd misunderstood about my life and capabilities. I think that's a conversation we should have with Michael present, I told Jessica. This affects all of us, and we need to figure out how to move forward as a family. She nodded, though I could see her mind was still processing the implications of everything she'd witnessed. The woman who had lectured me about understanding modern economics was now realizing she'd been getting business advice from someone who'd built a more successful enterprise than she'd ever imagined possible. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of conversations and connections. I exchanged contact information with several potential clients, received invitations to other networking events, and found myself being included in discussions about market trends and investment strategies. It was exactly the kind of professional recognition I'd been quietly building toward for years, and it felt validating to finally step into that space openly. As I drove home that night, I reflected on how much had changed in just a few days. The carefully constructed barriers between my public persona and my private success were crumbling, and I wasn't sure yet whether that was a good thing or a complicated one. But I did know that I was tired of hiding who I really was and what I'd accomplished. The next morning brought coffee with Michael at a small cafe near his school. He looked tired and stressed, clearly struggling to process everything he'd learned about his mother's hidden life. When I walked in wearing the same kind of modest clothes I'd always worn, it must have been jarring after Jessica's description of seeing me at the charity gala. "Mom, I feel like I don't know you at all," he said without preamble once we'd ordered our drinks. "Jessica came home last night talking about seeing you at some fancy hotel, talking business with wealthy people like you belonged there. I don't understand any of this." His confusion was genuine and heartbreaking. I'd been so focused on protecting myself from being valued only for my money that I'd failed to consider how my secrecy might affect my son's understanding of who his mother really was. "I'm the same person I've always been," I told him gently. "I just haven't shared everything about my life with you and Jessica." "But why?" he asked, and I could hear years of hurt and confusion in his voice. "Why would you keep something this big from your own family? Why would you let us worry about money and struggle with our finances when you could have helped?" It was the question I'd been dreading, because the answer required me to explain years of small hurts and accumulated disappointments that had led me to keep my success private. How do you tell your child that you've been protecting yourself from their spouse's greed and condescension? How do you explain that you've been testing their character without making it sound manipulative? "Because I needed to know who you really were," I said finally. "I needed to know what kind of man you'd become, what your values were, who you'd choose to marry. Money changes everything, Michael. It changes how people treat you, how they see you, what they expect from you." He was quiet for a long moment, processing this explanation. "But we're your family. Didn't you trust us?" The question cut deep because it touched on the fundamental issue at the heart of our relationship problems. Trust had been eroded gradually, through small incidents and accumulated patterns of behavior that had made me increasingly protective of my vulnerability. "I trusted you to be yourself," I replied. "And what I saw was someone who allowed his wife to treat me with disrespect and condescension. What I saw was someone who was changing into a person I didn't recognize, someone who seemed more concerned with social status and material possessions than with basic human decency." The words were harsh, but necessary. Michael needed to understand that this wasn't just about money or secrecy. It was about character and choices, and the kind of relationships we'd allowed to develop in our family. "Jessica doesn't mean to be disrespectful," he said, though his tone suggested he knew how weak that defense sounded. "She's just stressed about money and worried about our future. She wants us to be successful." "And what about what I want?" I asked. "What about treating me with basic respect regardless of whether you think I can contribute to your financial success? What about valuing our relationship for what it is rather than what it might get you?" We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us struggling with the implications of this conversation. This wasn't the relationship either of us had expected to have, and neither of us was sure how to navigate the new reality we'd created. "What happens now?" Michael asked finally, echoing the question he'd posed at the restaurant. Now we figure out whether we can build a better relationship based on honesty and mutual respect, I said. But that means you need to decide what kind of husband and father you want to be, and what kind of son. Because I'm not going to continue accepting treatment that makes me feel diminished and unvalued. The ultimatum was implicit but clear. Our relationship moving forward would depend on his ability to establish boundaries with Jessica and demonstrate that he valued me as a person, rather than just as a potential source of financial support. It wasn't an unreasonable expectation, but it was one that would require him to make some difficult choices about his priorities. As we left the cafe, Michael hugged me with the kind of desperate intensity that suggested he was afraid this might be our last conversation for a while. "I love you, Mom," he said quietly. "I'm sorry things got so complicated." "I love you too," I replied, meaning it completely despite everything that had happened. But love isn't enough if it's not backed up by respect and consideration. Those things have to be demonstrated, not just declared. That afternoon, I received a call from David Hartwell confirming our meeting and expressing enthusiasm about moving forward with his project. The conversation was purely professional, focused on timelines and budgets and design concepts, but it represented something important: validation that my work had value beyond my family's narrow understanding of what constituted real success. As I hung up the phone, I realized that I'd reached a turning point in more ways than one. I was no longer hiding my professional achievements or downplaying my financial success. I was no longer accepting disrespectful treatment in the name of family harmony. And I was no longer willing to pretend that love could exist without respect. The next few days brought a series of developments that confirmed how much everything had changed. Jessica called twice, leaving messages that attempted to strike a balance between apology and opportunity. She wanted to acknowledge her past mistakes while positioning herself to benefit from my connections and resources. The calls went unreturned. Michael sent several text messages updating me on their pregnancy and asking tentatively about getting together for dinner. His tone was different now, more careful and respectful, as if he was beginning to understand that our relationship couldn't continue on the same terms as before. Most surprisingly, I received a call from Jessica's mother, Martha, who had apparently heard about the charity gala encounter from her daughter. Martha had always been polite but distant in our interactions, clearly sharing Jessica's assumptions about my limited financial resources and social connections. "Linda, I hope you don't mind me calling," Martha began, her voice carrying the kind of forced warmth that suggested she had an agenda. "Jessica told me about seeing you at that lovely event at the Grand Metropolitan. I had no idea you were involved in such an impressive business." The conversation that followed was a masterclass in social repositioning. Martha spent 20 minutes praising my entrepreneurial spirit and expressing admiration for my business acumen, conveniently forgetting years of subtle condescension and dismissive comments about my lifestyle choices. "I've always believed that women of our generation need to stick together and support each other's success," she continued, apparently rewriting history to cast herself as a longtime supporter of my achievements. "I hope we can spend more time together now that we know how much we have in common." The irony was almost too rich to bear. Martha, who had spent years treating me like an embarrassing relative who needed to be tolerated for the sake of family harmony, was now positioning herself as a peer and potential ally. The transformation was so complete and so transparent that I almost laughed out loud. "That's very kind of you, Martha," I replied neutrally, not committing to anything but not rejecting her overture entirely. "I think it's important for families to understand each other better." After hanging up, I sat in my workshop contemplating how quickly relationships can change when financial dynamics shift. People who had been content to ignore or dismiss me were suddenly interested in cultivating connections. It was exactly why I'd been reluctant to reveal my success in the first place. The meeting with David Hartwell exceeded my expectations in every way. His estate was a stunning example of modern architecture enhanced by thoughtful integration of classic design elements. He had a clear vision for what he wanted to achieve and the budget to make it happen properly. More importantly, he understood that quality restoration work required time, patience, and significant upfront investment. He wasn't looking for quick fixes or shortcuts. He wanted pieces that would appreciate in value while serving as functional art in his living spaces. "I'm thinking about this as a 10-year project," he explained as we toured the empty rooms that would eventually showcase my work. "I want each piece to be perfect, and I'm willing to wait for the right opportunities, rather than settling for whatever's immediately available." It was exactly the kind of client relationship I'd always hoped to develop, someone who valued excellence over expediency and who understood that the best investments often require patience. We spent 3 hours discussing his vision and my ideas for sourcing appropriate pieces. By the time I left his estate, I had signed a contract that would keep me busy for the next 2 years and potentially generate more revenue than I'd earned in the previous 5 years combined. It was validation that my business model was sound and that my reputation for quality work was opening doors to increasingly lucrative opportunities. That evening, as I updated my financial records and began planning for the expanded business operations this contract would require, I reflected on how much my life had changed in just 2 weeks. The careful balance I'd maintained between my public persona and my private success was gone, replaced by a new reality where my professional achievements were becoming increasingly visible. The question now was whether my family relationships could adapt to this new reality, or whether the damage done by years of accumulated misunderstandings and disrespect was too severe to repair. I loved Michael deeply and wanted to have a relationship with my future grandchild, but I was no longer willing to accept treatment that diminished my worth as a person. The phone rang as I was closing my laptop, and I was surprised to see Michael's name on the caller ID. It was late for him to be calling, well past his usual bedtime on a school night. "Mom, can we talk?" he asked, his voice heavy with exhaustion, and something that might have been regret. "Of course," I replied, settling back into my chair and preparing for what felt like it might be an important conversation. "Jessica and I have been talking about everything that's happened," he began, slowly. "About the way she's treated you, about the assumptions we've made, about how wrong we've been about so many things." I waited, sensing that he needed to work through this at his own pace. "I keep thinking about all the times she made those comments about you being too old to understand things, about your hobby not being a real business, about you not knowing how money works. And now I find out you've been more successful than either of us ever imagined, and I feel like such an idiot." The pain in his voice was genuine, and it touched something deep in my chest. "You're not an idiot, Michael. You just made some assumptions, based on limited information." "But I should have stood up for you," he continued, his voice getting stronger. "I should have told Jessica that the way she was talking to you was unacceptable, regardless of what we thought about your financial situation. I should have been a better son." The admission was exactly what I'd been hoping to hear for years, but it came with complications. Acknowledging past mistakes was important, but changing future behavior would be much more difficult, especially with a wife who might not be fully committed to treating me with respect. "What are you planning to do about it?" I asked gently. "We want to make things right," he said. "Jessica wants to apologize properly, and we both want to find a way to move forward that works for everyone." I appreciated the sentiment, but I'd learned to be cautious about easy promises and quick fixes. "What does that look like to you, Michael? What does making things right actually mean in practical terms?" He was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking through his answer. "It means treating you with the respect you deserve. It means not making assumptions about what you can or can't understand. It means Jessica needs to change how she talks to you and how she thinks about you." "And if she can't or won't make those changes?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Then we'll have to figure out how to handle that," he replied, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely sure how such a situation might be managed. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with Michael trying to find ways to rebuild our relationship while navigating the complexities of his marriage. It was clear that he genuinely wanted to repair the damage that had been done, but it was also clear that he was struggling with competing loyalties and conflicting priorities. As we ended the call, I felt cautiously optimistic about the possibility of rebuilding our relationship, but I also knew that actions would matter more than words. Jessica would need to demonstrate sustained change in her behavior, and Michael would need to show that he could maintain appropriate boundaries with his wife when it came to how his mother was treated. The test would come soon enough. We'd agreed to have dinner together the following weekend, a chance for Jessica to offer her apology and for all of us to begin establishing new patterns of interaction. It would be the first time we'd all been together since the restaurant revelation, and it would likely determine whether our family relationships could survive this period of dramatic change. I spent the rest of the week preparing emotionally for what felt like a crucial encounter. This wasn't just about forgiveness or family harmony. It was about establishing whether we could build relationships based on mutual respect rather than assumed hierarchies and financial dependencies. The outcome would determine not just whether I had a relationship with my son and daughter-in-law, but what kind of relationship it would be. And for the first time in years, I felt like I had the power to influence that outcome rather than simply accepting whatever treatment was offered to me. The dinner was set for Saturday evening at a neutral location, an upscale bistro that Michael had chosen carefully. It was nice enough to feel special, but not so formal that it would add pressure to an already tense situation. I arrived exactly on time, wearing a simple but elegant dress that struck the right balance between my old, understated style and my new willingness to present myself as the successful businesswoman I'd become. Michael and Jessica were already seated when I walked in, and I could immediately sense the nervous energy radiating from their table. Jessica had clearly put significant effort into her appearance, wearing what looked like a new outfit that was probably intended to signal respect and occasion. Her smile was bright but brittle, like crystal that might shatter if handled too roughly. "Linda, you look wonderful," she said as I approached, standing to offer an awkward hug that felt more like a business gesture than a family greeting. "Thank you so much for agreeing to have dinner with us. I know things have been complicated lately." Michael stood as well, kissing my cheek with the kind of careful affection that suggested he wasn't entirely sure how I might react. "Mom, I'm glad you came. We've been looking forward to this all week." As we settled into our seats and reviewed the menu, I could feel both of them studying me, trying to gauge my mood and determine how this evening might unfold. The conversation started safely, with updates about Michael's work and careful inquiries about my recent business developments. Jessica asked polite questions about my restoration projects, though I could tell she was still struggling to fully comprehend the scope and sophistication of what I'd built. It wasn't until we'd finished our appetizers that Jessica finally addressed the elephant in the room. She cleared her throat nervously and looked directly at me with an expression that was clearly meant to convey sincerity and remorse. "Linda, I owe you a huge apology," she began, her voice steady but carrying an undertone of rehearsed precision. "I've been thinking a lot about my behavior over the past few years, and I realize that I've been incredibly disrespectful and presumptuous. I made assumptions about your life and your capabilities that were completely unfair and frankly embarrassing." I listened carefully, noting both what she was saying and what she wasn't saying. The apology was more comprehensive than I'd expected, but it felt calculated rather than spontaneous, as if she'd practiced the words until they sounded natural. "I was wrong to dismiss your business as a hobby," she continued. "I was wrong to assume you didn't understand modern economics or technology. I was wrong to treat you like you were out of touch or incapable of contributing meaningfully to conversations about current events or financial planning." Michael nodded along encouragingly, clearly pleased that his wife was making what appeared to be a genuine effort to repair the relationship. But I found myself waiting for something more, some acknowledgement of the deeper issues that had created this situation. I think part of the problem was that I was so focused on our own financial stress that I couldn't see past my assumptions about what you might be able to contribute, Jessica added. I was projecting my own insecurities onto you, and that wasn't fair. It was a thoughtful addition that showed some self-awareness, but it still felt incomplete. The apology was focused on the practical mistakes she'd made, rather than the emotional impact of her behavior or the fundamental disrespect she'd shown. I appreciate your apology, Jessica, I said carefully. It takes courage to acknowledge mistakes, especially ones that have affected family relationships. I could see relief beginning to relax her features, but I wasn't finished. What I'm curious about, I continued, is what you think needs to change going forward. Apologizing for past behavior is important, but it doesn't automatically fix the underlying attitudes that created the problems in the first place. The question clearly caught her off guard. She'd prepared an apology, but apparently hadn't thought as deeply about what sustained change would actually require. Well, obviously I need to treat you with more respect, she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely sure what that meant in practical terms. And I need to stop making assumptions about what you do or don't understand. That's a good start, I agreed. But I'm also wondering whether you've thought about why you made those assumptions in the first place. What was it about me that made you think it was acceptable to talk to me the way you did? Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly recognizing that this conversation was moving into territory that might not have easy answers. Jessica's expression tightened slightly, as if she was beginning to realize that this dinner might be more challenging than she'd anticipated. I guess I just saw you as someone from a different generation who might not be familiar with how things work now, she said, her voice becoming more defensive. I didn't mean to be condescending. I thought I was being helpful. It was exactly the kind of response I'd expected, and it revealed that her understanding of the problem was still superficial. She was apologizing for the symptoms of her attitude without examining the underlying beliefs that had created those symptoms. Jessica, I'm 62 years old, not 92, I said gently but firmly. I grew up during the computer revolution. I was an adult when the internet became mainstream. I've been using smartphones and social media for over a decade. The idea that my age automatically makes me incapable of understanding modern technology or economics is not just wrong. It's a form of prejudice. The word prejudice hung in the air like an accusation, and I could see both Michael and Jessica processing its implications. This wasn't just about misunderstandings or communication problems. It was about discriminatory attitudes based on age and assumptions about capability. I hadn't thought about it that way, Jessica admitted quietly, though I could see her mind working to process this perspective. I suppose I did make assumptions based on your age, rather than taking the time to actually get to know what you were capable of. It was a more honest acknowledgement than I'd expected, and it gave me hope that she might be capable of deeper reflection and genuine change. The thing is, I continued, those assumptions didn't just affect how you talked to me about technology. They affected how you talked to me about everything. You dismissed my opinions, ignored my suggestions, and treated me like my experiences had no value. That's not something that can be fixed with a single apology. Michael finally spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of someone who was beginning to understand the full scope of what had been happening in his family. Mom's right, he said, looking at his wife with an expression that was both loving and disappointed. I've been thinking about this too, and I realized that I enabled a lot of this behavior by not speaking up when I should have. We both need to make changes. Jessica nodded, though I could see her struggling with the implications of what we were discussing. This wasn't just about acknowledging past mistakes. It was about committing to sustained behavioral change that would require ongoing effort and self-awareness. What would you like to see from us going forward? She asked. And for the first time that evening, her question felt genuinely curious, rather than strategically motivated. It was exactly the question I'd been hoping she would ask, because it showed that she was beginning to understand that repair would require more than words. "I'd like to be treated as an equal," I said simply. "I'd like my opinions to be considered on their merits rather than dismissed because of my age. I'd like to be included in family decisions that affect me rather than having plans made for me by people who assume they know what's best." As I spoke, I could see Jessica mentally reviewing past interactions through this new lens, probably recognizing specific instances where she'd failed to meet these basic standards of respect. "And I'd like to know that if I contribute financially to your family's needs, it's because you value my generosity rather than because you see me as obligated to provide support," I added. This was the heart of the matter, the fundamental issue that would determine whether we could build a healthy relationship going forward. Financial support, if it happened, needed to be offered freely rather than extracted through guilt or manipulation. Michael reached across the table and took my hand, his eyes showing the kind of emotional maturity I'd been hoping to see from him for years. "Mom, I want you to know that we don't expect anything from you financially," he said earnestly. "If you choose to help us with the baby or the house or anything else, it should be because you want to, not because you feel obligated." It was exactly what I needed to hear, and the sincerity in his voice convinced me that he meant it. Jessica nodded along, though I suspected she was still processing the implications of what this might mean for their financial planning. "I think I understand now," she said slowly. "You wanted to know whether we valued you as a person or just as a potential source of support, and we failed that test pretty badly." The acknowledgement was more perceptive than I'd given her credit for, and it suggested that she was beginning to grasp the deeper dynamics that had been at play in our relationship. "It wasn't really a test," I replied. "It was more like self-protection. I've seen what money can do to family relationships, and I wanted to make sure our connections were based on genuine affection rather than financial interest." The conversation continued for another hour, covering everything from their expectations for raising their child to my plans for expanding my business. For the first time in years, it felt like we were having a real conversation among equals rather than a performance, where everyone was playing predetermined roles. Jessica asked intelligent questions about my restoration work and seemed genuinely interested in understanding how I'd built my business. Michael talked about his hopes for fatherhood with the kind of thoughtful enthusiasm that reminded me why I'd been so proud of him as a young man. Most importantly, they both listened when I spoke, asking follow-up questions and engaging with my ideas rather than waiting for their turn to talk or dismissing my perspectives as outdated. As we prepared to leave the restaurant, Jessica surprised me by asking if I might be interested in having lunch with her the following week, just the two of us. "I'd like to get to know you better," she said, and for the first time since I'd known her, the request felt genuine rather than obligatory. "I'd like that too," I replied, meaning it more than I'd expected to. The drive home gave me time to process everything that had happened during dinner. The conversation had gone better than I'd dared to hope, but I knew that real change would take time to develop and demonstrate. Apologies and good intentions were important first steps, but sustainable improvement would require ongoing effort from everyone involved. Over the next few weeks, I began to see evidence that the changes might be more than superficial. Jessica called regularly with questions about pregnancy and baby preparations, but her tone was different now. She asked for advice rather than demanding solutions, and she seemed genuinely interested in my perspectives based on my experience raising Michael as a single mother. Michael made an effort to include me in their planning discussions, seeking my input on everything from nursery design to childcare options. More importantly, when Jessica occasionally slipped back into her old patterns of assumption and condescension, he gently but firmly redirected the conversation in ways that protected my dignity. The lunch with Jessica turned out to be a turning point in our relationship. Away from Michael and the pressure of family dynamics, she was more relaxed and honest about her own insecurities and fears. She talked about the pressure she felt to succeed professionally, about her anxiety regarding motherhood, and about her fear that she wasn't good enough for Michael or his family. "I think I resented you because you seemed so confident and self-contained," she admitted over salad and wine. "I was struggling with everything, and you always seemed to have your life figured out. It was easier to dismiss you as out of touch than to acknowledge that you might actually have wisdom I could learn from." It was exactly the kind of honest reflection that I'd been hoping to see from her, and it helped me understand that her behavior had been driven more by insecurity than by malice. "Confidence is often just fear wearing a good disguise," I told her. "I've had plenty of moments of doubt and uncertainty. The difference is that I've learned not to let those feelings drive me to tear other people down." Our relationship didn't transform overnight, but it began to evolve into something more authentic and mutually respectful. Jessica started asking for my advice on professional matters, recognizing that my business experience might offer perspectives that could help her advance in her marketing career. I found myself genuinely enjoying her company and appreciating the intelligence and ambition that I'd previously seen only as threatening. The birth of my granddaughter Emma 6 months later marked another milestone in our family's evolution. Jessica's labor was difficult, and in the exhausted vulnerability that followed, she thanked me tearfully for all the support I'd provided during her pregnancy. "I don't know what I would have done without you," she said, holding my hand as we looked at the sleeping baby. "You've been so patient with me, even when I didn't deserve it." Holding Emma for the first time, I felt a surge of love and protectiveness that reminded me why family relationships are worth fighting for. Even when they require difficult conversations and fundamental changes, Michael proved to be a devoted father, approaching parenthood with the same thoughtful consideration he brought to his teaching. Watching him with Emma, I could see the values I'd tried to instill in him, reflected in his gentle patience and unwavering commitment to her well-being. My business continued to flourish as well. The project with David Hartwell led to referrals from his network, and within a year, I had more work than I could handle alone. I hired 2 assistants and rented a larger workshop space, officially transitioning from a solo operation to a small but thriving company. The financial success was gratifying, but even more satisfying was the recognition that my work had value beyond my family's narrow understanding. I was invited to speak at conferences about sustainable restoration practices, featured in design magazines for my innovative techniques, and consulted by museums about preserving historical pieces. Jessica often accompanied me to professional events now, genuinely proud to introduce me as her mother-in-law, and eager to learn about aspects of business and entrepreneurship that hadn't been part of her marketing education. She'd become one of my most effective advocates, referring potential clients and helping me develop online marketing strategies that expanded my reach. Michael, meanwhile, had been inspired by my example to pursue his own entrepreneurial interests. He began developing educational software for history teachers, combining his passion for education with his growing interest in technology and business development. The relationship between Jessica and me wasn't perfect, but it had become genuine in ways that our earlier interactions never were. We disagreed sometimes, but we did so respectfully, and we'd learned to value each other's perspectives rather than dismissing them automatically. Looking back on that painful period when everything seemed to be falling apart, I realized that the crisis had forced all of us to examine our assumptions and make conscious choices about the kinds of relationships we wanted to have. The financial revelation had been a catalyst, but the real work had been emotional and relational. I thought often about that moment in the restaurant when Jessica had asked why I hadn't told them about my financial situation sooner. The answer had evolved as our relationship deepened. Initially, I'd kept my success private to protect myself from being valued only for my money. But ultimately, I'd learned that hiding who I really was had prevented any of us from building authentic connections. The balance between privacy and honesty in family relationships is delicate and deeply personal. My choice to keep my financial success private had been motivated by legitimate concerns about how money can distort relationships, but it had also prevented my family from truly knowing and appreciating who I was as a person. Emma's first birthday party brought together friends and family who represented different aspects of my life that had previously been separate. David Hartwell and several other clients attended alongside my relatives, creating a celebration that reflected the integration of my personal and professional identities. Watching Jessica help organize the party with the same attention to detail she brought to her marketing projects, seeing Michael balance his responsibilities as a father with his growing business interests, and holding Emma as she took her first tentative steps, I felt a deep sense of completion. The woman who had once been dismissed as too old to understand modern life was now recognized as someone whose experience and wisdom had value across generations. The relationships that had once been strained by assumptions and misunderstandings had evolved into connections based on mutual respect and genuine affection. Jessica still occasionally caught herself making age-related assumptions, but she'd learned to recognize and correct these patterns quickly. More importantly, she'd developed the kind of self-awareness that prevented most such incidents from occurring in the first place. Michael had grown into the kind of man I'd always hoped he would become, someone who could balance competing loyalties while maintaining his core values, someone who could learn from his mistakes without being paralyzed by guilt, and someone who understood that true success includes the quality of your relationships as well as your professional achievements. As for me, I'd learned that protecting yourself from being valued only for your money doesn't require hiding your success entirely. It requires surrounding yourself with people who have demonstrated their ability to value you for who you are, rather than what you can provide. The business continued to grow, but I'd learned to maintain boundaries that preserved both my privacy and my peace of mind. Not every client needed to know the full scope of my financial situation, and not every family interaction needed to involve discussions of money or business success. Emma's presence in our lives had also created new dynamics that strengthened our family bonds. As her grandmother, I had a role that was distinct from my identities as Michael's mother or Jessica's mother-in-law. With Emma, I could simply be myself without the complicated history that had affected my other relationships. The story that had begun with painful assumptions about age and capability had evolved into something much richer, a narrative about growth, forgiveness, and the possibility of building better relationships even after significant damage has been done. Jessica never again suggested that I was too old to understand anything. But more importantly, she'd learned to approach our interactions with curiosity rather than assumptions. Michael had developed the backbone to maintain appropriate boundaries, while still honoring his commitments to both his mother and his wife. And I had learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept treatment that diminishes your worth, even when that refusal temporarily disrupts relationships that matter deeply to you. The bank transfers that Jessica had once assumed I wouldn't understand had become a symbol of something larger. The danger of judging people's capabilities based on superficial characteristics rather than taking the time to truly know them. 2. The end. The revelation of my financial success had been less important than the conversations it forced us to have about respect, assumptions, and the kind of family we wanted to be. Money had been the catalyst, but love, patience, and mutual commitment to growth had been the real transformative forces. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.